Before we begin today's story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because the story you're about to hear isn't just about fame or comedy. It's about what happens when laughter becomes a shield instead of a cure. For decades, Tim Allen felt like someone America could trust. He was the familiar face in the living room, the voice that reassured children, the man who embodied stability even when everything else felt uncertain. From sitcoms to animated classics, his presence felt safe and predictable. But what most people never realized was that behind the confident grin and booming voice was a man quietly fighting emotions he never learned how to process. At 70 years old, Tim Allen is no longer hiding the truth about the anger that followed him for most of his life. This isn't a story about scandal or downfall. It's a story about grief that never healed, resentment that hardened with time, and success that masked pain instead of resolving it. Long before Hollywood applause, before laughter paid the bills, Tim Allen was just a boy named Timothy Dick, trying to understand a world that broke without warning. Timothy Dick grew up in Denver as one of 6 children in a household that was busy, loud, and comfortably ordinary. His father, Gerald, worked in real estate, while his mother, Martha, was deeply involved in community service and family life. Their home wasn't wealthy or glamorous, but it was stable. There were routines, expectations, and a clear sense of who belonged where. For a young boy, that kind of structure creates safety without needing explanation. But that safety disappeared in 1964 when Tim was just 11 years old. His father was killed suddenly in a car accident, with no warning and no time to prepare emotionally. One day his father was simply there, and the next day he was. The loss was absolute and disorienting. Tim later described that moment as the first time the world stopped feeling reliable. There was no gradual adjustment, no closure, only absence. His mother was left to raise 6 children alone while managing her own grief, and while the family survived, something essential had fractured. The house grew quieter in ways that couldn't be explained, and Tim learned early that life could change forever without permission. Grief doesn't always announce itself loudly, especially in children. Sometimes it hides behind silence, confusion, or anger that doesn't yet have a name. For Tim, that grief settled deep and stayed unresolved. His mother did her best to keep the family together, but grief forced her into survival mode. 2 years after losing her husband, she remarried, introducing a stepfather into the household. For an adult, this might have felt like rebuilding. For an 11-year-old still frozen in loss, it felt like replacement. The new stepfather, William, brought discipline, structure, and emotional distance. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. Rules were enforced, expectations were high, and emotional comfort was scarce. For Tim, this didn't feel like guidance. It felt like intrusion into a space that already felt broken. He didn't yet understand that adults cope differently. All he felt was that something precious had been taken, and now someone else was standing where his father once stood. That resentment didn't explode immediately. It grew slowly, quietly, feeding on small moments of misunderstanding and emotional disconnect. And without realizing it, Tim began building his identity around resistance instead of healing. As Tim moved into adolescence, the anger he never learned to express properly began shaping his behavior. Authority figures became symbols of control rather than guidance. School felt less like opportunity and more like confinement. Rules weren't boundaries, they were challenges. This wasn't rebellion for attention. It was rebellion born from unresolved grief and a need to reclaim control. Drugs and alcohol entered his life not as experimentation, but as escape. They dulled emotions he didn't understand and quieted thoughts he didn't want to face. What started casually escalated quickly, feeding a cycle of avoidance that felt easier than confronting loss. His relationship with his mother became strained, trapped between her loyalty to her new marriage and her fear for her son's direction. Yet even in chaos, Tim remained intelligent and driven. He enrolled in college, first at Central Michigan University and later at Western Michigan University. And it was there in the early 1970s that something unexpected changed the direction of his life. He discovered comedy, not as entertainment, but as survival. On stage, he could transform frustration into laughter, pain into punchlines, and confusion into control. Comedy gave him a voice without demanding vulnerability. Stand-up comedy became Tim Allen's emotional translator. On stage, he could talk about masculinity, family tension, and disappointment without ever admitting how deeply those themes affected him. The audience laughed, but for Tim, comedy served a different purpose. It allowed him to release pressure without confronting the source. Humor became both shield and weapon, protection from pain and control over how others perceived him. But as his confidence grew on stage, his off-stage life became more reckless. The late 1970s comedy scene was chaotic and saturated with substance abuse, and Tim fit into it seamlessly. In 1978, everything collapsed when he was arrested for possession of more than 650 grams of cocaine. He was facing the possibility of life in prison just as his comedy career was gaining traction. To avoid a devastating sentence, he cooperated with authorities, testifying against others involved. His sentence was reduced, and he served just over 2 years in prison. Behind bars, there was no audience, no applause, no laughter to hide behind. Prison stripped away illusion and forced stillness. For the first time, Tim had no distractions, only himself. When Tim Allen was released from prison in the early 1980s, he didn't step into redemption. He stepped into reinvention. Lowe's Angels offered anonymity, opportunity, and distance from everything he had been forced to confront. He committed to sobriety and returned to comedy with relentless discipline. On the surface, it looked like transformation. Internally, it was avoidance refined into structure. He performed constantly, rebuilt his reputation, and quickly became a regular presence at major comedy clubs. His material was sharp, observational, and unmistakably masculine. He joked about tools, relationships, frustration, and everyday absurdities. Audiences saw confidence, but what they didn't see was how carefully constructed that confidence was. Comedy became armor, polished, and reliable. Television appearances followed, then stand-up specials. By the early 1990s, Tim Allen wasn't just rebuilding, he was breaking through. Fame arrived fast, bringing money, security, and validation. Yet none of it addressed the unresolved anger he carried from childhood. Achievement replaced introspection. Work filled the space where healing should have been. The more successful he became, the easier it was to avoid the questions he didn't want to answer. The role that defined Tim Allen's career arrived with deep irony. He was cast as Tim Taylor, a well-meaning but emotionally guarded father on a family sitcom centered around home improvement and domestic life. The show became an instant phenomenon. Tim Taylor was clumsy, stubborn, but loving, a flawed man who always returned to his family by the end of each episode. Audiences connected immediately. For millions of households, Tim Allen became part of weekly routine. But privately, the role stirred unresolved conflict. A man still wrestling with anger toward a father figure was now playing one on television every week. Every scripted lesson about communication and emotional growth highlighted what he had never fully processed himself. The applause was loud, but the contradiction was louder. He was praised for portraying warmth while feeling emotionally distant from his own past. Awards and ratings reinforced the illusion that success equaled healing. It didn't. Outside the sitcom, his career expanded rapidly. Films followed, voice work expanded his reach, and his image became synonymous with reliability. But the pattern remained unchanged. Work distracted. Achievement delayed confrontation. The laughter never reached the root. When Tim Allen became the voice of Buzz Lightyear, his career entered an entirely new dimension. Buzz was confident, authoritative, and unwavering in his sense of purpose. Children trusted him instantly. Parents felt safe with him. That voice became associated with bravery and loyalty. But behind the microphone was a man who still struggled with doubt and emotional fatigue. Voice acting allowed him to project certainty without revealing vulnerability. His live-action roles continued reinforcing a familiar image, men navigating masculinity through humor while avoiding emotional exposure. Again and again, Tim played characters who joked instead of confessed, who deflected instead of confronted. One dramatic role briefly cracked the surface, revealing a quieter sadness beneath the performance. Critics noticed, but Tim quickly returned to safer ground. Off-screen, his voice became tied to nostalgia, tradition, and reassurance. He became a symbol of stability, even as his private life felt unsettled. As he aged, His public persona shifted toward overt resistance to cultural change. In later sitcoms, the line between character and reality blurred. The roles felt personal, shaped by decades of emotional defense rather than performance alone. Fatherhood eventually forced a reckoning Tim could no longer avoid. He had daughters now. He wasn't just playing a father, he was one. And with that came questions he had spent a lifetime avoiding. What kind of father had he become? What emotional patterns was he passing on? His first marriage ended, but without bitterness. He remained present for his daughter, determined not to repeat the absence that defined his childhood. Years later, he built a second family, recommitting to stability with greater intention. Outwardly, it looked like maturity. Internally, it was confrontation. In interviews, Tim began speaking without jokes. He admitted something that shocked longtime fans. Despite immense success, there were long periods where he genuinely hated his life. Not because of fame, but because unresolved anger poisoned everything. He realized that much of his resentment had never truly been about his stepfather. It was about loss, about a goodbye he never got. Forgiveness didn't arrive dramatically. It came quietly through age and reflection. Holding onto hatred hadn't protected him, it had trapped him. As Tim Allen entered his later years, the pace slowed and the distractions faded. Without constant production schedules and public validation, he was left with himself. And that was the hardest part. Fame had amplified everything except peace. Achievement delayed healing, but it never replaced it. In later interviews, Tim didn't dramatize his confession. He simply told the truth. Success had hidden wounds, not healed them. Comedy had saved his life, but it had also postponed confrontation. Today, his life is quieter and more intentional. He works less, listens more, and values presence over applause. The anger hasn't disappeared, but it no longer controls him. Numbing it changed everything. Tim Allen spent decades making the world laugh while quietly struggling inside. His story isn't a warning against success. It's a reminder that healing requires more than achievement. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe success can truly heal old wounds, or does it sometimes just hide them longer? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that go beyond the spotlight.